friends, and welcome back to CS Mentor. In this video, I'm going to be continuing with the chapter Law of Torts. So in the previous video, I had completed the definition of tort, wherein we had seen four definitions, that is one by Salmond, one by Winfield, one by Fraser, and finally section 2M of the Limitation Act. Then we saw the general conditions for liability of a tort, wherein we saw three conditions that are essential to become a tort. So in this video, I'm going to be continuing with the third topic, and that is the liability. So before we move on to what liability is, we must first understand this term known as mens rea. Now, simply put, I will say that mens rea is a guilty mind. Now, this word mens rea doesn't just turn up on its own. It is actually part of a legal maxim that is present over here. So the full legal maxim is read like this: actis non fecit reum nisi mens sit rea. So what does this mean? The act itself creates no guilt in the absence of a guilty mind. So what is this act that they're talking about over here? Remember, we said for a tort to be committed, some kind of a wrongful act must be committed. So this is the act that they're talking about. Now, simply committing the act without a guilty mind does not make the person guilty. So let's assume that there is a table, and on this table I find that there is a jar of chocolates. I see this jar of chocolates and nobody is standing around this place. So what I do is I go up to this jar, I put my hand into this jar, I take the chocolates and I keep going. Now what I didn't know is that this jar actually belonged to Veena. Now Veena kept this jar on the table and it was her chocolates, and she specifically told everybody around her not to touch her chocolates. But at the time that I came there, nobody was there. I saw the jar on the table and I obviously went and I took it. And according to Veena, I stole the chocolates. But I said that, no, I didn't know about it. I didn't take it with the intention of stealing. Had I known it was yours, I wouldn't have touched it. So what is absent when I took these chocolates? A guilty mind was absent. And therefore, even though I committed the act of taking the chocolates from this jar, I have not committed a tort. So let me give you a little more serious example of what mens rea is. Okay, let's assume that I am a person and I have a knife in my hand. Okay, now this knife is just a cooking knife, like I use it to cut vegetables. But then what happens is one person comes and starts annoying me, constantly saying nonsense to really irritate me. Okay, and at one point they go ahead and let's assume that this person says something that does not sit well with me. So what I do is I take this knife and I stab this person. So what happens then? I stab this person over here and now he is bleeding. He's not completely injured, but he is bleeding. What I did over here is a crime. What did I do over here? I took the knife and I stabbed the person. Now that is not correct. Here I have both done the act and this person kept saying something against me, and the fact that I was holding the knife and went ahead to stab him itself shows some amount of guilty mind. But that's what this mens rea states. The answer doesn't simply lie with, oh, she stabbed that other person, so she's definitely guilty. No, it doesn't work that way. There's one amount of proof that needs to exist. So what is this proof? Mens rea needs to be proved. Mens rea is guilty mind. So this level of proof varies for civil wrongs and criminal wrongs. In civil wrongs, the amount of mens rea to be proved is very little. In some situations, mens rea does not even have to be proved. Whereas in criminal wrongs, the amount of mens rea to be proved is extremely high. And only if mens rea is proved, the accused can be found guilty. So in this situation, I can say that it was a crime. The fact that I stabbed another person with a knife is a crime. But my guilty mind, or the mens rea at the time that I committed this crime, needs to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt if it's a criminal wrong. Whereas in civil wrongs, regardless, okay, even if you don't have a guilty mind, it's okay, you will still be punished for it. So the fact that cookie jar example that I gave you, the fact that I took cookies from this jar, okay, even though I didn't have a guilty mind, I am liable to be punished for it. Now, why is there such a big difference between proving mens rea for civil wrongs as well as criminal wrongs? The answer is simply that for civil wrongs, the punishment is usually just a fine. Okay, or in if I have to use legal words, damages, some kind of a monetary compensation. Whereas in criminal wrongs, there is a possibility that I can even go to jail. And therefore, before you put a person in jail, it is very, very important that you have to prove that that person, that is the accused person, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And how do you do that? You have to prove mens rea. Now, in this particular chapter, since tort law is essentially a civil, a type of civil law, so we're only going to be talking about the civil wrongs. Here, we're not going to be touching into criminal wrongs. So, remember I said that in civil wrongs, the amount of mens rea that needs to be proved is very little. In fact, in some situations, mens rea does not even have to be proved. If you see this last line over here. And that is what I'm talking about, exceptions. So what do you mean by exceptions? It means that mens rea need not be proved. And the situation which arises where mens rea need not be proved is known as strict liability and absolute liability. So friends, I hope you all are clear with the concept of mens rea. Simply put, mens rea means guilty mind. It is fashioned after the Latin maxim that is actus non fecit reum, nisi mens sit rea. It simply states that an act itself creates no guilt in the absence of a guilty mind. Now, the amount of mens rea to be proved is very little in civil wrongs as compared to criminal wrongs. Since tort law is largely civil law principles, we will only be looking at that. And in civil law principles, there are some situations where mens rea need not even be proved. So where does mens rea need not even be proved? That is in the case of strict liability and absolute liability. So before we move on to what exactly the strict liability and absolute liability is, let us first understand what you mean by liability. So when a person, let's say Ramu over here, has committed some kind of a wrongful act. Let's say that he has committed a tort. Okay. Against who? He has committed a tort against Shamu. Now, Shamu over here is the victim, correct? And Ramu over here is the perpetrator or the offender, because he's the one who has committed the tort. Now, when Ramu commits the tort, then Shamu can approach the court of law. Okay? Shamu can approach the court of law and file a suit against Ramu. When he files a suit against Ramu, Ramu will be held liable for committing this tort. So therefore, I can say that Ramu has an obligation. What obligation? Since tort law states that if any tort has been committed or any civil law has been violated, then the offender has to pay up some kind of monetary compensation to the victim. So this monetary compensation is what I would call the obligation. So therefore, if we have to read this again, liability means that an obligation has been created on the wrongdoer the minute he has committed a tort. So I know I said that Shamu will approach the court of law and only after that his liability starts. That is actually not correct. The minute the tort is committed, Ramu now has a liability to give back to Shamu in the form of some kind of compensation. But who is the one who enforces that? It is the court of law. So I hope you all have understood what exactly a liability means. Simply put, a liability arises the minute the wrongdoer commits a tort. So friends, there are actually only 3 types of liabilities. 2 if you have to look at it, but we've divided it into 4 parts. So what are those 4 parts? The first one is strict liability. The second one is absolute liability. Now, if you have to look at strict liability and absolute liability, in a way you can say that it is the same. In fact, strict liability was introduced by way of a case law known as Rylands versus Fletcher, which we will be studying about later, in the courts of England. Whereas absolute liability was introduced in the Indian courts. It is simply It is simply a change up of the principle of strict liability. So essentially, I can say that strict liability and absolute liability are the same. The next kind of liability is known as vicarious liability. Now, this vicarious liability applies slightly differently where it involves the government. So friends, wherever you all come across the word state, they do not mean individual states like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or Delhi. They don't mean that. When they mean the state, they essentially mean the government of India or the government of whichever country. So the same principle of vicarious liability will apply slightly different when it's in relation to the government. So let's move on to the first concept, that is strict liability. So friends, before we move on to strict liability, there is a small distinction that you need to understand. They have made a distinction on the basis of three points in your textbook. The first point is liability for inevitable accident. Now, this is the concept that I would call as strict liability. The second one is liability for inevitable mistake. This is what I would call as absolute liability. And the third one is vicarious liability for wrongs committed by others. This is simply, as the word suggests, vicarious liability. Alright, so please don't get confused over here. Now, as I said, I'm going to be starting with the first part, and that is the concept of strict liability. Now, what is the level of mens rea that needs to be proved? It is none. Remember I said that? In the case of strict liability and absolute liability, mens rea does not need to be proved. But there are 6 exceptions to that case, which we will be studying about later. But first, what is this concept of strict liability? So this rule was actually implemented in the case of Rylands versus Fletcher. Now, as you can see over here, Rylands is the plaintiff. That means he is the victim. He is the one who was aggrieved by the act of Fletcher, who is the defendant. So what are the facts of this case? The defendant, that is Fletcher, was the owner of a mill. Now, to supply water for this mill, Fletcher appointed some independent contractors to build a reservoir so that he can supply water for his mill. Now, what these independent contractors did not realize was that there were tunnels underneath this reservoir which was basically filled with earth. So they didn't notice that there was a tunnel underneath. Alright. Now, in the adjoining property, let's assume that the adjoining property is somewhere over here. This property belongs to Rylands. Alright. So what happened was, after the reservoir was built, one day there were heavy rains and the water had overflowed and the structural integrity of this reservoir broke and the water overflowed into these tunnels and finally overflowed into Rylands' property. Alright, and Rylands' property was a coal mine and therefore completely destroyed the entire property by flooding it all up. And therefore, Rylands has gone ahead and filed a suit against Fletcher. So what can be understood out of this was that the building of this reservoir was an unnatural thing. That means this reservoir was man-made. That is the most important thing to understand in this case. It was man-made, and I can say that it was an unnatural thing. Unnatural means anything that does not belong to the earth the way it is naturally. So take for example, if a tree is growing in one spot, then it is not unnatural for that tree to grow in that spot. It is very natural for it to be there. But then if you bring a Bengal tiger all the way from India into Australia, then that tiger is an unnatural thing in a foreign land. Alright? Or this is the example of bringing in animals into the property. But what if you had simply built a structure, like say a water theme park? That water theme park is not a natural structure. If that entire structure came crashing down and hurt people, then I can say that it is man-made and unnatural in nature. So, this is the first thing to note over here. Secondly, this unnatural thing had escaped from the defendant's land and had hurt the plaintiff. It had escaped from the defendant's land and caused some kind of damage or harm to the plaintiff. And this is the case of Rylance versus Fletcher. And in this case, Justice Blackburn, one of the judges, essentially said that if a person brings anything into his own land for his own purpose and that thing escapes, then that person will be held liable if that thing escapes. Very simple. So if anyone brings anything into their land and that escapes, then that person will be held liable for that land. Now in this case it was water, and the water came flooding into Rylance coal mine and completely damaged everything. Now what if, like I had given the example of the Bengal tiger, what if the Bengal tiger had escaped from its cage and went ahead and killed a lot of people? Then can the Bengal tiger be held liable for killing people? No, right? It is the person who brought the tiger into his property for whatever purpose he brought the tiger into. He will be held liable for the same. The next case is Reed versus Lyon. So again, as the case states, this is the plaintiff and this is the defendant. Now in this case, what had happened was the plaintiff, that is Reed, was the employee in the company of Lyon. So Lyon held a company which basically provided for the government. And what did they provide? Explosives. So what happened was that these explosives were mishandled in some way and had caused this huge blast which hurt a lot of people, including the plaintiff. So the plaintiff approached the court and filed a suit against the owner of this company, and that is Lyon. Over here, what the court did was they took the principle laid down in Rylance versus Fletcher, and they held that if you are bringing in something unnatural into that land, then it is not simply enough that something was brought into the land. It was made very clear that that unnatural thing must have escaped. Over here, the explosives had not left the premises of Lyon's land. It had simply burst within his own premises, within his own property. Now, while the case is not extremely sound, these two cases are usually read together, that is Rylance versus Fletcher and Reed versus Lyon, because while Rylance versus Fletcher laid down the rule that if you bring anything into your property and it escapes, then that person will be held liable, in Reed versus Lyon, they specified that both conditions must be satisfied for the principle of strict liability to apply. So it is not enough that the defendant merely brought something unnatural into his land. Rather, that unnatural thing must have escaped the land and caused harm to the plaintiff. Only then the rule of strict liability will apply. Otherwise, the rule of strict liability will not apply. So friends, I hope you all are clear with this concept of strict liability. Now we're going to move on to the next one, and that is absolute liability. But first, let's look at the exceptions to the principle of strict liability. There are 6 exceptions, and we'll look at each one of them individually. So the first one is natural use of land. So what was the first condition for strict liability to apply? There must be some kind of unnatural use of land. So if there was a natural use of the land and that thing escaped or caused harm to people, then we cannot apply the principle of strict liability. Now, what if the Bengal tiger belonging to India, existed in and around the premises of one person living in Bengal? Let's assume that he had a 200-acre property, and the Bengal tiger would come into this property and would generally roam around over here. And if one person was inside this property and got attacked by this Bengal tiger, then this person cannot go and file a suit against the owner of this property, saying that the principle of strict liability has to apply to him. It doesn't work that way. Only if it is an unnatural thing, only then the principle of strict liability will apply. The second one is consent of the plaintiff. What do you mean by consent of the plaintiff? If the neighboring property is owned by A and B brings in, say, the Bengal tiger into his property. Now, before he brings the Bengal tiger into his property, what B does is he gets the permission of A. He tells A, see, buddy, I am getting a Bengal tiger from India, and I'm taking proper precautions before I bring it into the property. I suggest you also take those precautions, and suggests to put a fence around A's property so as to make sure that the Bengal tiger does not ever come into A's property. Now, B has done everything on his part to be able to bring in this Bengal tiger into his property. But what A does is he does not take care of this fence. In fact, he lets it lie simply, and there are holes in this fence, or it's not properly built in some areas. And when the Bengal tiger, if and when the Bengal tiger crosses into A's property and causes harm to some person over there, A cannot file a suit against B on the principle of strict liability. So this is only known as consent of plaintiff. If the plaintiff, that is this person A, had already given his acknowledgement stating that okay, you can go ahead with it, then this principle will not apply. The third exception is known as the act of third party. What do you mean by act of third party? Now, for the principle of strict liability to apply, there must be some plaintiff versus a defendant. That means the defendant's thing or whatever unnatural thing he brought into his property must harm the plaintiff. Okay? But what if the defendant had taken all proper precautions to ensure that such a thing does not escape, and instead some person, some third party, stranger comes in and interferes with that unnatural thing, and as a result it escaped the property and then caused harm to the plaintiff? So where it is the act of a third party, or essentially I would call a stranger, then in such a case the principle of strict liability will not apply. So in the case of Box versus Job, the defendant had a reservoir, and this reservoir overflowed because some stranger blocked the drain connecting to the reservoir. So it was not the defendant's fault that this reservoir overflowed. It was because of some third party, that is some stranger, who'd come in and interfered with the entire process that so and so happened. Now the fourth one is statutory authority. Now the government is usually involved in storing large amount of water, or even supplying electricity, or a whole bunch of things. Now what if this water escapes, or what if this electricity escapes and causes some kind of harm? Then simply being a statutory authority, that is simply a governmental authority, they are escaping this kind of strict liability, because this statutory authority is being a duty is being put on them by law to ensure that there is proper supply of water and electricity. If there is any kind of a leak or any escape from the property, then regardless, simply by being a statutory authority, the principle of strict liability will not apply to them. The fifth one is act of God. What if a tsunami hits? Or what if an earthquake hits? Now this earthquake and tsunami is out of the control of man. Now the defendant couldn't have possibly thought that a tsunami will affect this place, or an earthquake will strike this property, and as a result of the tsunami or earthquake or some activity which is beyond the control of man, then as a result of that unnatural thing escapes, then he will not be held strictly liable. But let's take for example Japan. Now Japan is very prone to earthquakes. Japan is very prone to earthquakes. Now in Japan, knowing that there is a high chance of earthquakes happening, if a person brings in some unnatural thing, like let's say a nuclear reactor, and as a result within a year or two there's an earthquake over there, then they cannot take this defense saying that act of God, because they should have known that this place is constantly prone to earthquakes. that we should not have brought a nuclear reactor here in the first place, because we can never predict the size of the earthquake or the intensity of the earthquake. So the answer is simply that an act of God has one condition: it must be completely unforeseeable. And finally, you have plaintiff's own default. So till now, we were saying that there is the plaintiff versus the defendant. And it was the defendant's unnatural thing which escaped and caused harm to the plaintiff. But what if the plaintiff himself was the guilty party over here? What if the plaintiff himself one day decided, oh, let me sneak into my neighbor's property and let loose the Bengal tiger? And so he sneaks into the defendant's property and he removes the lock to the tiger's cage. So this was the plaintiff's own fault. When it's the plaintiff's own fault, then he cannot take the defense. Then he cannot take the defense of strict liability and file a suit against the defendant. So friends, these are the 6 exceptions to strict liability. Let me go through that again. The first one is natural use of land. The second one is consent of plaintiff. The third one is act of third party. Fourth one, statutory authority. Fifth one, act of God. And finally, the sixth one is plaintiff's own default. So I can say that the concept of strict liability was set up in the courts of England. And in the courts of England, they said that if a person brings in anything unnatural into his land and it escapes, then that person will be held strictly liable. But there are 6 exceptions to this rule, and these are the 6 exceptions. So now we're going to move on to the principle of absolute liability. Now, like I said, the principle of absolute liability is almost the same as strict liability. How is it different? The answer simply lies in the fact that there are no exceptions. So strict liability had those 6 exceptions, whereas in absolute liability, there is no exception. Okay, and why are we changing the name? Why is there a difference between strict liability and absolute liability if in essence they're the same? Now, this comes from the case known as the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy took place in Bhopal, wherein the Union Carbide plant had started leaking a kind of poisonous gas. Now, this poisonous gas was an aerosol, and therefore it spread very easily in the air and it affected hundreds and thousands of people. In fact, it didn't just affect the people in and around the area, it affected all the babies that were born in the future. And that was the intensity of this tragedy. Now, this tragedy happened at a time when we had no such precedent prior to this Bhopal gas tragedy. And MC Mehta, environmentalist lawyer, filed a public interest litigation on behalf of the victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy. And that was the case of MC Mehta versus Union of India. Now, since the judges had no precedent, they had nothing to follow upon, they had to bring in the principle of strict liability. But the principle of strict liability, when you read it with the case of Rylance versus Fletcher and Reed versus Lyon, then you'll notice that in Reed versus Lyon, they were very specific that an unnatural thing has to be brought into the land and it must escape. In addition to that, there were 6 exceptions. Okay, so at any point in time, the defendant could interpret any one of these 6 exceptions and get away with it. The judges in our country, after seeing just how much this tragedy affected the people, changed the concept of strict liability and said that even though the defendant brought in something unnatural into the land and it escaped, there will be no exception that this person can take. But more importantly, we cannot keep interpreting the rule as was laid down by Rylance versus Fletcher. In fact, we have to make it much more simple in the sense that they said that if any industry brings in any kind of inherently dangerous thing into their industry, then automatically they become absolutely liable if some accident occurs. So, like I said, it's the same as the principle of strict liability, but here it is very specific to industries. And the minute they bring in something inherently dangerous, so over here it was the case of a chemical, the minute they bring in that inherently dangerous thing into their industry, they become automatically liable. And even if some accident occurs, they can take no defense whatsoever, and they will be held absolutely liable for the same. What do you mean by liability? That means they have an obligation to pay up the persons who are injured. So friends, this is the difference between strict liability and absolute liability. And the concept of liability simply lies in the fact that there is an obligation created on the defendant the minute he commits a tort. But for much more serious offenses, such as, take for example the Bhopal gas tragedy, or in the case of Rylance versus Fletcher, in that situation they said that to prove that a liability exists, mens rea needs to be proved. But in these situations, mens rea need not be proved, and a person can automatically be held liable for the same. So let's look at a quick difference between strict liability and absolute liability. In strict liability, there must be an unnatural use of land. Unnatural thing must have escaped. In absolute liability, it applies specifically to industries carrying on any kind of inherently dangerous activities. So in the case of Bhopal gas tragedy, it was the case of a chemical leak. And this also includes bringing in some kind of a unnatural thing into the industry. The industry has an absolute and non-delegable duty to the community to ensure that the unnatural thing does not escape. And the next difference is that in strict liability, there are 6 defenses which can be taken, whereas in absolute liability, no defense can be taken. So friends, that's all for this video. So to quickly recap, we studied about mens rea, we had studied about liability, wherein we had come into the concept of strict liability and absolute liability. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you leave, and I shall see you in the next video.